It's time for Myth of the Week.
All right, yeah, so we have an awesome myth this week, and this one is pretty funny. So, true or false, all electrical equipment is required to be UL listed. So, there's a little bit of a trick in there because a lot of people, and actually there's a lot of people that said that this was true based on the fact that some inspectors will only accept a UL label, and that's what makes this actually false, is that nothing in the code would actually require that to be like, UL doesn't have like a monopoly or anything, like but this one's really interesting. This actually came from one of my apprentice's teachers, and I don't know if you remember this, James, but I asked you live on the NEC live show if class 1 transformer is required to be listed.
I remember.
And the thing that's funny about that, when you look at it, is, in all actuality, how do you list a piece of iron with copper wrapped around it? Oh, it looks like Cameron's got a question. So it'll be probably in about maybe like 30 minutes, 45 minutes. It'll be a little bit after like 7 my time is usually when we get to the Willie quiz. We'll probably start it, we'll probably start it, like, we might even cut out one of the segments if we have to, if people start showing up right around 7. But I think that'd be 8 at
Central.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think he's in Central Time. He's in Winnipeg.
Basically in about 40 minutes.
Yep, something like that. But anyway, so this is really interesting, and I ran into this a lot, like out in the gas and oil, out in the patch. Almost nothing is listed out there. We're doing a lot of custom-made equipment. I'm putting the Willie Jackerson listing on a lot of stuff out there, and we're getting inspected. Like, a lot of times we're sitting there, like, they're witnessing the torque as we're torquing this stuff. So it's not like we're just getting away without doing something correctly. And then we actually have field evaluation body that comes through, looks at it. We actually have the plant engineer that comes out, looks at it, and you'll have at any given time, you'll probably have at least 4 to 5 sets of eyes on it to make sure that you're following all the different things that they want. And there's not really any specific standard that they're going off of. They just want to make sure that you're drilling the holes correct, and you're using the right hardware, and you're torquing it correctly, and you're using the right thickness of busing for like that ampacity rating, and there's just a bunch of little stuff that goes into it. But me and old Lemonhead, we always came out on top with that, and they always said it looked better than what could have come from the factory. So that always meant a lot from that standpoint. But like I say, a lot of these, I could tell James's ears perk up when I talk to him about them, and he's like, oh, I got something for that. And so I really like this illustration you put up there, James. It's
good. I've got a few illustrations. One of the things we had, I don't remember when we did it, to be honest, but does NEC override the UL listing and labeling? And I said, hell no, it doesn't. And
yeah,
I went through a whole thing. What was interesting about that is, a lot of times, mainly it's the ECD boys that want to argue with me, but I save some stuff because I let them hang themselves a little bit by asking very direct questions, and then they say, oh no, they don't have anybody that does that. And so then I pull out and I say, well, if you go over here and look at 1910.7 B23, it goes through and lists all the people that are involved in order to create the testing procedure to make it an ANSI standard, and also an ASTM standard for right, testing materials and stuff. And when you go in and you look at it, one of the things, they even have experts from that are experts on the NEC when it comes to deciding how they're going to list and label equipment. Now, I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you here as I run through all of this. I'm even going to get into talking about custom made equipment because there's so much equipment that's out there, especially like the ballpark that's out there. They design their own equipment, and that takes me right back here to approval. So when you go look at, let me give you a little example. When you go look at 110.3B, it talks about the listing and labeling. And then if you look at 110.3A, that's where you get into the installation use of everything, and it gives you all these items that you have to consider when you're designing that equipment. Okay.
Sure.
Then if you look at 110.2 says that all your equipment has to be approved. And then when you go look at the definition of approved, that's over in Article 100, it says acceptable to the authority having jurisdiction. So a lot of times what happens is the oil fields and everything, your companies, Exxon, Mobil, British Petroleum, Marco, Texaco, all of them, they sometimes design their own equipment. I mean, they probably know better than the UL standards know. And
Sure.
they'll go out there and they'll design that equipment to make sure the equipment meets their needs, and it's also designed and installed in a safe manner. And then them being the authority having jurisdiction, they're the ones that give the approval of the equipment. And that's nothing uncommon there.
Yeah, and so I'll give an example. What we run into a lot is too much overcurrent protection. A lot of times what they'll do is they'll send out a sub panel, and it'll have a main breaker, and then that'll go feed an outbuilding, and then that'll have a main breaker, and then that'll feed something else, and that'll have a main breaker. And they don't want all those separate overcurrent devices. They want to selectively coordinate them to one overcurrent device. And so a lot of times that's what we're doing is we're going and taking all those overcurrent devices out and just making one primary overcurrent device, and there's nothing that's violating the code. It's just making it more selectively coordinated to where they just have that all going to one point.
Sure. And if you notice right there in the illustration, we tell you the top note at the top, we tell you to look at the definitions of listed, labeled, approved, and identified. There's a reason we're telling you to start right there. And then you'll notice we get in and we tell you when you're looking at Underwriters Laboratories there, we pull it underneath it and we talk about listed, labeled, installation rules, and use of equipment. Okay, those are things they have to do in order to get approval of the equipment. Now, when you look here and watch this, this is where you go in and you get into your third-party certification. And if you look right back here where we were just at, we tell you right here in their note, OSHA now has approved about 15 testing laboratories, and then we give you some third-party certification that you would look at here. Okay?
Right.
Now, one of the things I want to point out is we give you key sections there. Okay, what are those key sections? Well, what's 90.7? That's your examination of equipment there.
Yeah.
Okay, and then when you go to 110.2, that's your approval, and then you get 110.3 B and C, you get into your listing and labeling. Okay, and
one thing I ran into this week too is it's kind of part of that definition of equipment. What is defined as equipment?
Sure.
You know, like a wire nut could be electrical equipment.
Sure. I mean, I pretty much consider everything pretty much. But, one of the things I like to point out here is by UL, they're recognized as a NERDL. Okay. They're a nationally recognized testing laboratory. Now, when you get into this, let's look at what the purpose is here. Now, you don't have to take my word for anything. All I would tell you to do is just take this one illustration right here and you get in and look at the purpose of your custom-made electrical equipment. And the first thing I'm going to point out here is right in the middle. It's in red there. It says designed by. Well, what are you designing by? And you've heard me say this when we were doing this for if the NEC overrode it. It says it's designed by what? The NEC. It tells you, and now if it was Canadian, it'd be the Canadian code. But here we're talking NEC. They have to take that in consideration, and then they
Okay.
look at their other two standards that they'll use as UL 508 and 508A, and then they tell you that these testing standards and everything become an ANSI C series, and then for industrial control equipment, look at NFPA 79. And then
Right.
right over beside to help tie that in, we give you the NEC rules here to look at, which I just discussed, and then here's your OSHA rules. Okay, now let's take a look from there. Now I have to decide here, as being a nationally recognized testing laboratory, look at my OSHA loop there. What is the first section we give you? 1910.7. That is the requirements that they put on a NERDL and what they are required to do in order to be considered a national testing laboratory. Okay.
Right.
And then if I look at 1910.303A, that's the start of everything right there, where you start getting into your listing and labeling, which ties you in with the definitions in OSHA 1910.399. And then you'll notice we give you the OSHA rules right down on the bottom left-hand side there, and we tell you 302 through 308. Well, why do we start at 302? Because I even gave an outline back then talking about March the 15th, 1972. Any equipment that was installed before that date is grandfathered in. Anything from that date to April 16th, 1981, if you did 50% or more repair within the, say, a room or a facility, then you had to bring everything up to that current code. And then anything after that was up to whatever the code was at that point. Okay?
Yeah, and that's where you get into that grandfather clause. There is, and just so everyone knows out there, my apprentices ask me this a lot. They're like, hey, do I always have to bring this up to code? Well, if you touch it, pretty much you got to bring it up to code, is the way that was kind of the rule we used to do. But in an actuality of the actual NEC, if it is, like, let's just say, for example, you're doing a panel swap and you have a 3-wire range. You can leave that a 3-wire range because that was considered code compliant at the time of install. So all you're doing is you're swapping the panel. Now, if you move the panel further than 6 foot and you move those conductors further than 6 foot, you might be required to do arc fault on a bunch of those bedroom circuits and a bunch of those circuits that require AFCI. So that's one thing you got to look into too.
Yeah. And then you come over here and look, we tell you, look, you're going to be looking at applying UL 508 here. And if you look once again, when you're applying UL 508, we put the design in here and tell you exactly what you need to do. And this is what gets me, is if I was going to take and I'm going to do custom made equipment, you know, I have an arrow pointing there. If this is industrial, we tell you here, not only are you going to be looking at NEC, but you need to consider NFPA 79. And then that ties
those
in
are also
with what? 110.2 and 110.3A1 through A8. Now, why didn't we put 110.3B there? Because you're designing with the code in mind, which is what? Your design and installation there in 110.3A. And that's what I'm telling you.
And then that would fall back on that approval you're talking about.
That's right. And that's why I wanted to take and